my name is Beck and welcome to some audiobook recommendations for beginners. Of course, they're for everybody, but if you're a beginner wanting to get into audiobooks, these are awesome places to start as well. Most of these are going to be like sci-fi and fantasy audiobooks, but there are a few kind of contemporary ones on here as well. So let's jump into my list. The first one on here is Daisy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid. This is probably in a fair few recommendations lists for audiobooks, but there is a reason for it. So if you're avoiding it, may as well just go and give it a try. This follows a band and it's a fiction, so it's not a real band. But the way that this audiobook is put together, it made me feel like it was a real band because each band member has a different voice actor. And so the way that this book is put together, I think if I was reading it physically, I would struggle to associate whose voice was talking in terms of understanding the characterization. But when it came to the audiobook, it was so easy to pick up. And it was also so varied that it was easy for me to pay attention to as well. And when I first started listening to audiobooks, sometimes I found that it would be hard to pay attention to the narrative as it was occurring, and so I'd miss small details, whereas now I can absorb it as like second nature. So if that's something you're struggling with, I think Daisy Jones and the Six would be a really good place to start because it's constantly so varied, and so it keeps your attention in that sense as well. And it also follows these characters as they form like a ragtag band, but it does have heavy aspects of drug use and drug abuse as well. So if those are themes that you want to stay away from, then maybe Daisy Jones and the Six isn't for you, but it is a wonderful audiobook. Next, I also want to recommend another contemporary, and this is more of a young adult thriller or young adult mystery, and it's called Sadie by Courtney Summers. Usually I'm not a person who's into young adult contemporaries, let alone mysteries, but the first two books on this list are just kind of variations on the theme of what I usually read, and I really enjoyed both. So Sadie is on here because it follows our main character Sadie, and so she has a perspective in here, but it also tells it from a podcast because Sadie is going on this mission. She's kind of put herself on this personal quest to go and track down her sister's murderer and kill him right back. So essentially that's what Sadie is doing, but because she has different stops on this quest, I guess of a lack of a better term, to go and do this thing, the podcast is following along in her footsteps. So because we only get pieces of the podcast and pieces of Sadie's perspective kind of in tandem, we don't actually know presently where Sadie is, we just know where she was and what she did in the past. So it's a mystery in terms of trying to find out where she went. And because it's a podcast, it had, all of that ambience associated with a podcast, and it also made the narration vary as well. So it wasn't as varied as Daisy Jones and the Six with, like 6 different narrators, but this had at least 2 or 3. And the way it did it made it feel very authentically a podcast. And I think if I'd read it as a physical book, again, I wouldn't have got that same gratification from the plot. I think if I'd read it physically, I would have knocked a star off. But because of the delivery of the audiobook, I ended up giving this a 5 stars. And that's why I want to put it on this list, because I really enjoyed it. And it would be great for people who are just getting into audiobooks as well, because I know there are tons of true crime podcasts. So it's a really easy pivotal point to jump over and jump ship into listening to a fictional book instead. Next is a little bit more of a jump because it's straight into an adult urban fantasy book, and it is The Dresden Files by Jim Butcher. The first book in here is Stormfront, and this follows Harry, who is a wizard detective, and he takes on cases with the police. It starts off formulaic, but it becomes even more expansive with the world building. But this first book is very much centered on Dresden, and I've heard that Jim Butcher wrote this as like a way to prove his professor wrong when it came to writing a formulaic book. So he wrote this with all of the stereotypes and all of the tropes that one would expect from an urban fantasy. So for anyone who's new to the genre, thank you, Motorbike. So for anybody who's new to the genre and just new to audiobooks in general, I think this would be a really awesome point to start because it sets everything up for you in not a very beginner way, but just a way that entry into the series is really easy. And then from this point and after the second book, he's probably realized, I actually need to give more substance and more reasoning to the things I set up in the past. And that's definitely what he does. And that's why I've loved this so much, because not only has it grown Dresden, but it's grown all the characters around him as well. And it's grown the world building and the magic too, and all of the supernatural creatures that we encounter. So this is very expansive. And the way that the audiobook is, it's just from one narrator, but it's from James Masters, and he was on Buffy, I believe. I haven't actually seen Buffy. I know, shock horror, but he was on Buffy. He was also in Smallville, and the way that he captures Dresden's voice and he does the voices for other characters that Dresden talks to, he does it so well. And so many people who are fans of this series have become fans because of the audiobook narration. So that is why I wanted to put it on here, because even though it's only one narrator, it's a stunning job and it's an easy series to get your teeth into because it sets you up so specifically with Dresden and his environment and his goals. So that's why this is on here. Also because I'm loving this series right now and I will recommend it every chance that I get. Next is more of a sci-fi audiobook, and that is Red Rising by Pierce Brown. This starts in a kind of young adult aspect and then it grows beyond that because the themes kind of overtake the story and Darrow goes on this big adventure. This audiobook narrator is on my list because I was a little bit hesitant to go into Red Rising because I wasn't sure if I would like it, but the way that the narrator does it, our main character Darrow is from a lower class part of society and he is trying to rebel against the Gold, who are the high up of society. Everything is corrupted and so he's part of this rebellion to bring it to its knees essentially. And so because he's from this lower rung of society, he would have grown up away from all of this and he has different accents and different ways of speaking. And so when he's thinking, that's what the audiobook narrator does. He puts on a different accent for Darrow. But when he's actually talking out loud, he puts on a different accent for when Darrow is actually verbalizing things. So you get that differentiation between Darrow's internal dialogue and his external dialogue and how he's interacting with everybody. And because of that variation, I really connected to this and it gave it more nuance than I was expecting. And so I fell headfirst into loving these books. I gave this one a 4, but I gave the other 2 in the trilogy a 5 stars each. So I hit the ground running essentially with this series and really enjoyed it. But it's very much a brutal series when it comes to violence. This starts out as kind of like a sci-fi version of The Hunger Games, but more brutal, but then it grows past that into something else. But the audiobook is excellent. So you probably should give it at least a sample to see if you like it or not. I'm pretty sure this next book is on everyone's recommendation for starting an audiobook, but I'm going to include it anyway because why not? I really enjoyed the trilogy. So it's The Themis Files by Sylvain Neuvel. The first one is Sleeping Giants, and this follows a bunch of characters. Again, it's told with different narrators, and they are very formulaic in terms of they're talking about reports and interviews, so it's very much in that stylized format, but it really works for what the story is. So the premise is this girl named, I think Rose, when she's a little kid, falls into a hole, and this hole is like the size of a house, and inside the hole is a giant robotic hand, and she falls right into the hand. And after that point in her childhood, we now time skip forward and she's the lead scientist investigating what kind of alloys, metals, and substance this hand is, what is going on, because more parts of a body have started to crop up on different continents, and then how she's going to treat this whole situation. And it's expansive from that point on, because once they start cropping up, you need more than just one investigative scientist on the job, really. So that is where the series starts, and it becomes a lot more expansive, as you would expect of a trilogy. But while the first 2 books are very action oriented, the third one does have action in it, but it's more human focused. So don't go into the third one expecting like huge climactic battle scenes or anything like that. Just go into the third one expecting a really good conclusion on what we've already seen established. Because I know a lot of people, or I know at least some people, have read the third book and been, this is disappointing. But I read the third book and I was like, I really enjoyed that. So you've just got to have your expectations aligned with what the book is probably going to deliver. But anyway, audiobooks, wonderful. Again, it's really good with your attention span. I listened to this when I first got into audiobooks and I was just enraptured on the train. Like, I did not realize that other people were around me, and I was fully into this audiobook, which kind of worked to my detriment at one point because I burst out laughing and forgot I was surrounded by people. So it definitely is immersive, I can give it that. The next audiobook recommendation I have is also a fantasy standalone, which we don't really see a lot of, and it's Kings of the Wild by Nicholas Eames. This is one that is told from our main character's perspective, Clay, so there is only, again, one narrator, but his voice is so like sardonic and sarcastic, but also very descriptive and just genuine. So I think if you're someone who wants to start fantasy reading, this is a good entry point as well. And if you want to start listening to more longer audiobooks, this is a good place to start as well. It's not super long, but it's long enough. And it follows these characters that go on a quest, because they in the past used to be heroic characters who would go on quests to save things. But now they're older, so they've kind of aged out. So they've started their own families, they've started to settle down, but one day one of the old bandmates comes around to Clay and is like, yo, my daughter's been kidnapped, so please help me out, mate. And obviously Clay has to go on the quest, because if he didn't, there would be no story. So he goes on this quest with his friend Gabriel, and they are going to save Gabriel's daughter from being kidnapped. So that's what this very much follows, trying to get the band back together, essentially. And because it's all told through Clay's perspective, it's told in a uniform way, in the same voice, so it's easy to follow, it's very fun, and again, I just love Clay's narration because it's subtle and it's also dry humor in parts as well. So if you're not paying attention, you'll miss it. But if you've had a few warm-up practices with multiple narrators, I think this would be really easy for you to follow along with. The next one on here is Northern Lights. So His Dark Materials book 1, which is The Golden Compass. It's got so many names that I get so confused, but it's essentially a book 1. Because it's for kids on Audible, I know it's done by a bunch of different narrators. One of my favorite narrators, Rupert Dagus, does a few voices, and he did the voice for Name of the Winds audiobook, and that's one of my personal favorite books of all time, and he did a wonderful narration for that. But I kind of tried to not include it as a specific recommendation on this list because I know that it's a very long audiobook. So for new people and beginners to audiobooks, it would probably be a lot of work to get through. So if you're feeling confident and brave, go for Name of the Wind because it's awesome. But for this video, I'm just going to recommend the first book in His Dark Materials, which has Rupert Dagus in it sometimes. And because it's told, again, from a child's perspective, the writing is easier to understand. It's not necessarily simplified, but it's just more to the point. Lyra is a character who has been raised by the church because she's an orphan, and in this world everyone has their own demon, like a literal demon that can shapeshift, and when you get up to a certain age it finds its true shape and it stays that shape. But because kids have these demons that can shapeshift and everything, they're a little bit more volatile in a sense and they're more freeform, and one day kids start going missing and Lyra is like, I need to get to the bottom of this, and she becomes involved. So that's the start of book 1, but because we only follow Lyra and a few other characters around her, it's easy to understand the narrative that is intended, and the way that variations on voice actors come in, it gives more breadth and more shape to the book, and it's designed for kids to hold their attention. So if you're like me, you're constantly flicking through all of the social media apps on your phone, you're getting distracted by text messages from your friends, you're going to Netflix and watching no, you will focus on this audiobook because it's varied and it will hold your attention. If it holds a kid's attention, it can hold my attention, so it can probably hold yours as well. And then for the last book on this list, I wanted to recommend one that is kind of adult contemporary but also has a sci-fi aspect in the sense that it's like a first contact with aliens story, but the audiobook isn't very long either, and the audiobook narrator is very engaging, even though it's only, again, it's one narrator, but it's very engaging, like I said, so it shouldn't be a struggle to focus on what this person is saying, and that is an absolutely remarkable thing by Hank Green. This has been one of my favorite books ever, and the sequel also clocked a 5 stars from me. It's only a duology, so there's only 2, but this follows our main character named April, and she comes across a weird statue at like 2 a.m. when she's walking home from work because she's living in New York City, she's got a crappy job, and she's trying to make ends meet and she's not really succeeding. She sees this statue and calls up her friend Andy and is like, Andy, we need to make a video on this. And she does a weird, silly video about it and then posts it online and then goes to sleep. And then the next day she wakes up and the entire media is trying to get in touch with her. And it turns out that this statue is not of Earth, and a ton of other statues like it have cropped up all over the world in the blink of an eye on the same day. And she was essentially the first person to report on it. So everyone wants to interview her because now they're all cordoned off and no one can go near them. And she was near it, she's touched it, and all that kind of thing. So because Hank Green is a YouTuber with quite a significant following, he also is understanding of the effect of social media and effect of media attention, and also of parasocial relationships, which are relationships that often exist online. And that is what this essentially follows. It's very much centered on identity, but it also has a sci-fi flair to it as well that makes the flavor of the book really interesting. And I listened to this audiobook practically in 2 sittings and I was obsessed with it. I loved it. So if I can listen to it in like 2 sittings, you can definitely give it a try as well. Narrator, again, is wonderful, and kept my attention for the whole book. Also because it's kind of like a character study on April and how she's not a perfect person. And it's also kind of a mystery because everyone has this shared dream that they need to solve. It does have that mystery flair to like the center of the book. So I think that will capture your attention if nothing else. So that is what this video is going to end on, with a recommendation, because I love it and I want more people to read it. So yeah, there we go. Those are my audiobook recommendations for beginners. Of course, if you listen to audiobooks all the time, you can still listen to these because I have and I loved them. But let me know any audiobook narrators that you really like or any audiobooks that you've really enjoyed recently, because I'm on a constant cycle of listening to audiobooks. Honestly, they just save my reading and they make me read so much more every month. Thank you so much for watching this video. I'll chat to you down in the comments and I'll see you in my next one. Bye.